In today's world, screens come in one of two shapes: portrait or landscape. And it's not just screens, almost all images fit into these categories as well. In school, you were probably told to put your paper in portrait or landscape orientation, depending on what you were writing or drawing. We print in portrait or landscape. We buy postcards that are portrait or landscape. Most books are portrait and most films are landscape. And we all know the grating tension of a TV or cinema clip being cropped to fit the vertical TikTok format, or worse, not being cropped at all. But where did these two formats come from? And why are we so beholden to a rectangle? The direct origin of the terms portrait and landscape come, of course, from the fine art medium of painting. A vertical rectangle has long been held as the best way to show a seated or standing portrait of a powerful person with lots of money, while the sideways rectangle has traditionally been used to show the vast amounts of land that that person owns. These two genres of painting dominate European art. In fact, most paintings from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century that you'll see in an art museum will fit into one of these two categories, with a few exceptions for other genres like still life painting, genre scenes, religious scenes, and history painting. But to understand the real origins of portrait and landscape, we have to go back further than that. Way back. We're going back to the 1st century CE, to a place in modern-day Egypt called the Fayum Basin. Now you might think that an Egyptian mummy is the furthest possible thing from a vertical TikTok video, but I'm going to show you the story of how we got from this to this. And just a quick note, this isn't a definitive history. There are many theories about the origins of portraiture and landscape, but this is the one that I like the most, and the story that I think tells us the most about who we are and where we came from. The Fayum Basin is an oasis in the Egyptian desert. The civilization that we know as ancient Egypt had existed in this region for thousands of years. But in the 1st century CE, this region was a particular melting pot of cultures and ethnicities because it had been ruled and occupied first by the Greeks and then by the Romans. During this period of Greco-Roman occupation and rule, a new burial practice emerged where wealthy people would have a portrait painted of their dead relative and then bind that portrait over the face of the mummy. A remarkable number of these portraits survive today due to really lucky conservation circumstances, and they are incredibly moving to look at. These faces from 2,000 years ago seem so alive. They seem like someone you could just pass in the street today. Whenever I'm at a new museum I haven't been to before, I always check out the ancient artifacts displays to see if they have any Fayum portraits. But these beautiful paintings don't just tell us about changing funeral practices in Egypt in the 1st century. They also represent a big shift in Western visual culture. To understand this shift, just look at how Egyptians were depicting people before. For many ancient civilizations, the standard way to depict the human figure was full length from head to toe. Egyptian art is famous for this motif, but many other cultures depicted people in similar ways. So how did we get from this to this? Now, these Roman Egyptian funerary paintings were by no means the first portraits in this style. Although very few examples survive, Roman portraiture in both wall painting and on wood panels was likely the inspiration for this practice. In fact, the Fayum portraits were probably just one type of portraiture being painted in the Roman Empire during this period, but because of the ideal conditions that they were buried in, they've survived in far greater numbers than other types. Also, it's important to remember that the Fayum portraits are removed from their original context, which was bound to the head of a full-length mummy. So in this way, the cropping of these portraits may not have been done to create a portrait in the modern sense, but perhaps rather to save money instead of decorating a whole coffin or casket by prioritizing the most important part of a person's identity: their face. But these paintings opened up the door for the possibility of portraiture as we see it today, shoulders up in a vertical rectangle frame. And the format would soon expand far beyond funerary purposes. Some art historians argue that the Fayum portraits, along with other Greco-Roman portraiture that's now lost, were actually precursors to the Christian icon. Icons are portrait-style paintings of saints and holy figures, often embellished with expensive and beautiful materials like precious gems, the lapis lazuli blue pigment that was mined in Afghanistan, and of course, gold that came from as far away as sub-Saharan Africa. Like the ancient Egyptians, early Christians often depicted saints full length, but over the Middle Ages, the crop style portrait became a really popular style of icon painting. Just like with the Fayum portraits, the cropped icon has a sense of intensity. Similar to how in film today we use a close-up to express intense emotion and to elicit a response from the viewer, an icon painting functioned as a devotional object, often trying to elicit empathy and reverence from the viewer. But in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, people started looking at icon paintings and thinking, I'd really like a picture of myself that looks like that. And with innovations in painting technique and the invention of the canvas, the genre of portraiture that we know today started to take shape. And despite centuries since and huge innovations in technology like the invention of photography, digital printing and screens, the vertical rectangle has remained the most popular way to frame pictures of people. So where does landscape come into all of this? Well, when it comes to the Western tradition, landscape painting wasn't really a genre in its own right until the 16th century. They often existed as secondary subject matter, as the setting of a religious scene or behind the sitter of a portrait. Take, for example, the Mona Lisa. Despite the hype, the Mona Lisa is not that different from other portraits of its time. The woman in the picture was a noblewoman called Lisa Gherardini, and just like many other Renaissance portraits, there's a landscape behind her. But it wasn't until the 16th century that the landscape was able to extract itself out of the background of portraiture and become a genre in its own right. The landscape genre was first developed in the Netherlands, where a rapidly growing middle class had a new appetite for decorative arts. The Dutch were strictly Protestant and couldn't have icon paintings or religious scenes in their homes, but they did have money, most of it coming from their colonial ventures in Africa, Southeast Asia, India, and the Caribbean, and they wanted to spend it. Secular subjects like landscapes and still life were considered a-okay by Protestant rules, and soon other parts of Europe were producing landscape paintings en masse as well. But why paint landscapes in horizontal rectangles? After all, not all cultures around the world agree that landscapes should be horizontal. In China and Japan, for example, many landscape paintings were traditionally painted on vertical scrolls. Well, the clue might be in the words themselves. The word horizontal comes from the word horizon, which is from the Greek and Latin word for boundary, as in the boundary between the earth and the sky. Horizontal as a word only really emerged in Europe in the 16th century, interestingly, about the same time that the genre of landscape painting happened. Western visual culture in this period was obsessed with linear perspective, which is the idea that an image should be made as though from a single point of view and made as mathematically and accurately as possible. This obsession with the horizon is what confined European landscape painting to the rectangle, maximizing width of view while still sticking to the principles of perspective. And just like with portraiture, not a lot has changed since the 16th century. These two formats, portrait and landscape, have well and truly stuck. With the invention of photography, however, a new challenge emerged. Suddenly, we had a new image-making tool that could create both portrait and landscape pictures just by turning the device 90 degrees. In the early days of photography, though, it wasn't that simple. Early cameras couldn't rotate, so they had to invent a rotating plate at the back of the camera that could change the orientation from landscape to portrait, and vice versa. But once cameras became handheld and portable, this of course was no longer an issue. Today, however, portrait and landscape are facing possibly their biggest challenge yet. For decades, landscape has been the favored orientation for film and video, and although there's been many different aspect ratio changes over the years, they have all been, without exception, horizontal. And then came the smartphone. Suddenly, people started filming videos without rotating their phone to the side, because let's be honest, it's not that convenient to hold your phone sideways. This has of course led to the rapid rise of vertical video platforms like TikTok and Snapchat, and spawned countless copycat features like Instagram Reels, Stories, YouTube Shorts, and so on. I find it interesting that in the early days of vertical video, the apps themselves weren't even optimized to play vertical content. We'd always see black bars on the sides. People were making vertical video before vertical video apps even existed, which really shows that it's our desire to film vertical that has created these apps that we know and love today. But the main driving factor in the rise of vertical video, I believe, is deeply related to our visual cultural tradition of portraiture that goes back centuries. While landscape-oriented cinema is about storytelling and setting and filming interactions between people, the vertical video format is primed for a single subject, shown shoulders up, talking directly to the viewer. Selfie mode is to portraiture what cinema is to landscape. Just another instance in history where people have selected the best format to tell the world, here I am.